In the war rooms of Europe, they laughed. Hitler's generals called the Americans soft, playboys in uniform, men who'd never stomach real war. To them, the Wehrmacht was forged from iron and centuries of blood. The Americans, from comfort and jazz records. But in June 1944, as dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, that myth died in fire and salt water. Within 48 hours, the soft ones would breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall, something the world's best armies said was impossible. This is the story of how arrogance met reality and lost. Act 1. The Myth of the Soft American. The Victor's Delusion. By late 1943, the smoke of Blitzkrieg still hung sweet in German memory. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in 40 days. The Soviet Union bled but held, and now the Reich turned its eyes westward, toward an inevitable Allied invasion. In the wood-paneled war rooms of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Hitler's supreme command, the question wasn't if the Anglo-Americans would come, but whether they'd even make it past the surf. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, leaned over maps of the French coast with the weary confidence of a man who'd seen too many enemies break. Around him, staff officers smoked and studied intelligence reports on American divisions training in England. The assessments were dismissive, almost casual. Mechanical farmers, one Abwehr report read. Heavy reliance on material superiority, minimal combat spirit. Accustomed to comfort and luxury, will break under sustained pressure. The ideology ran deeper than military analysis. Nazi racial theory had spent a decade teaching that industrial democracies produced soft men, that comfort bred weakness, that diversity meant disunity, that a nation without struggle couldn't create warriors. America, with its automobiles and movie theaters and constitutional liberties, embodied everything the Third Reich defined itself against. They have ice cream factories in their military camps, an SS officer reportedly joked at a Berlin reception. What army brings ice cream to war? Hitler himself dismissed American military potential with theatrical contempt. At a 1943 strategy session, he'd waved off concerns about American industrial capacity. "What does it matter how many tanks they build," he said, "if they haven't the stomach to die in them?" The factory boys. What the Germans saw as weakness was something else entirely. In England, throughout 1943 and early 1944, a citizen army took shape. They came from Detroit assembly lines and Texas ranches, from Kansas wheat fields and Brooklyn tenements. Most had never fired a weapon in anger. Many had barely left their home states before the war. They were sons of immigrants, grandsons of Civil War veterans, boys who'd grown up during the Depression and learned that survival came from grit, not glory. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, a medical orderly from the Bronx, wrote to his mother in April 1944. "You asked if I'm scared. I'd be lying if I said no, but I'm more scared of letting down the guys next to me. We're all scared, Ma. That's what makes us brave, I guess." They trained in the mud and rain of southern England, rehearsing amphibious assaults until their hands blistered and their uniforms stank of seawater. They practiced medical medicine, learned to operate radios under fire, studied aerial photographs of Norman coastline until they could navigate it in their sleep. They wrote letters home, played cards, went to dances in village halls, and tried not to think too hard about what was coming. The German intelligence apparatus watched and recorded but failed to understand. They saw soldiers who complained about the food, who griefed when packages from home didn't arrive, who seemed to need constant entertainment and reinforcement. They didn't see the adaptability, the problem-solving instinct, the democratic ethos that made every private believe he had a stake in victory. The warning ignored. Not all German commanders shared the arrogance. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, newly appointed to oversee coastal defenses, had fought Americans in North Africa. He'd seen how they learned, how they adapted, how their initial stumbling gave way to systematic competence. In Tunisia, American forces had turned early defeats into decisive victory through sheer organizational flexibility and material abundance. "The Americans are not to be underestimated," Rommel wrote to his wife in January 1944. "They start poorly but improve rapidly. Their strength lies not in individual heroism, but in method, in resources, in a collective determination that's harder to break than fanaticism." He threw himself into fortifying the Atlantic Wall with obsessive energy. Millions of mines went into the sand. Steel obstacles sprouted on every beach where landing craft might come. He wanted to defeat the invasion at the waterline, before American logistics could establish a foothold. But at the highest levels, his warnings dissolved into Hitler's intuition and the General Staff's prejudice. When Rommel requested more panzer divisions near the coast, he was refused. When he warned that Allied air superiority would paralyze German reinforcement, he was told to have faith in German fighting spirit. The Führer himself remained convinced. The Atlantic Wall was impregnable, and even if breached, the Americans lacked the will to sustain offensive operations. "They are incapable of sacrifice," he declared at a March strategy conference. "One bloody nose and they'll negotiate." And so, as spring turned toward summer in 1944, the stage was set. On one side, the most elaborate invasion in military history. On the other, an empire that had mistaken its enemy's humanity for weakness. Act 2. The Gathering Storm. The Impossible Plan. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, hidden in the English countryside, General Dwight Eisenhower carried the weight of the world on his Kansas shoulders. The plan, Operation Overlord, was audacious to the point of madness. Land 150,000 troops on a hostile coast in a single day against an enemy that had been preparing for this moment for years. 5 beaches, 5 divisions in the first wave. Thousands of ships and aircraft coordinated across miles of churning water. Paratroopers dropping in darkness. Naval bombardment. Engineering teams to clear obstacles under fire. And all of it dependent on weather, timing, and the courage of young men who'd never seen combat. "The only thing worse than fighting with allies," Churchill had once quipped, "is fighting without them." But Eisenhower had turned that challenge into strength. British planners brought experience. American industry brought material. Canadian divisions brought fierce determination. Polish and French units brought personal stakes. It was a coalition held together by shared purpose and Eisenhower's diplomatic genius. The deception operations alone were masterworks. Operation Fortitude convinced German intelligence that the real invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Fake armies appeared on reconnaissance photos. Radio traffic suggested massive force buildups opposite Calais. Even General George Patton, whom Germans respected and feared, was positioned to command this phantom force. German commanders bought it completely. Hitler kept most of his panzers north of the Seine, waiting for the real invasion that would never come. But on June 4, 1944, as assembled invasion forces waited in their ports, the weather turned vicious. Storms lashed the channel. Eisenhower's meteorologists gave him impossible choices: postpone and risk losing surprise, or proceed and risk disaster in rough seas. Eisenhower walked alone through the night, shoulders bent. He'd already written a statement taking full responsibility for failure. At 4 a.m. on June 5, with a brief weather window predicted, he made the decision that would define the war. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll go." The other side of the wall. That same night, across the Channel, the Atlantic Wall slept. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was at his headquarters near Paris. Rommel had driven to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and plead with Hitler for more tanks. Many division commanders were away at a war game exercise in Rennes. The weather seemed too poor for invasion. After years of false alarms and heightened alerts, a certain fatigue had set in. At the fortified positions overlooking the Norman coast, German soldiers sat in their concrete bunkers and watched the storm. Some played cards, others wrote letters or slept. Their officers had assured them no sane commander would attempt an amphibious assault in such weather. The invasion, if it came at all, would come at Calais in better conditions. The Atlantic Wall itself was an impressive construction, if incomplete. Rommel's additions, the mines, the obstacles, the repositioned artillery, had made the beaches far more dangerous than they'd been a year earlier. But the wall remained more propaganda than reality, strong at certain points, thin at others, and catastrophically vulnerable to the one thing Rommel feared most: Allied air power. In the early hours of June 6th, coastal radar stations began detecting something strange: aircraft, hundreds of them, crossing the Channel. But reports went up the chain slowly. Officers were away, communications were delayed, and the weather still seemed impossible for a major operation. Then the paratroopers began dropping into the darkness behind the beaches. The last hours of peace. On the invasion fleet, pitching through rough seas in darkness, American soldiers tried to prepare their minds for what was coming. Many were violently seasick, hunched over in the crowded holds of landing craft, trying to keep down K rations that tasted like cardboard. The boats rose and fell sickeningly, salt spray soaking through wool uniforms. Some men prayed, others checked and rechecked their weapons. A few tried to joke, but the laughter came out brittle. 22-year-old Sergeant Ray Lambert of the 16th Infantry Regiment sat with his back against cold steel and thought about his two brothers, already wounded in earlier campaigns. He'd promised his mother he'd look after them. Now he was heading into what everyone knew would be the bloodiest beach, Omaha. "I never felt so scared in my life," a private from Ohio wrote in a letter he'd sealed before boarding. "But I guess that's courage, being scared and going anyway. Don't know if I'll mail this or not. If you're reading it, I guess you know how things turned out." The naval bombardment began at 5:50 a.m., the gray dawn split by fire and thunder. Battleships and cruisers hammered the German positions with thousands of tons of shells. The sound was apocalyptic, beyond anything human scale. It should have pulverized the defenses, but the Atlantic Wall was concrete and earth, dug deep and reinforced. Much of the shelling fell inland or short. The German positions, constructed by Rommel with exactly this scenario in mind, weathered the storm. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft lowered their ramps. The soft Americans went to war. Act 3. The Fire of Normandy. Omaha, the crucible. The ramp dropped and the ocean became fire. Machine guns opened up immediately, converging fields of fire that had been plotted for months. The first men off the boats died before they could take a step. Others tried to use their bodies as shields, pushing forward into water that ran red. Some drowned, weighed down with equipment, pulled under by the current and the chaos. Private Robert Sales watched the man next to him, a kid from Pennsylvania who'd shown him pictures of his girlfriend the night before, take a round through the throat and collapse into the surf. There was no time to help, no time to think. only the animal imperative to move forward, to get off the beach, to find cover that didn't exist. "Swim!" someone screamed. "Swim to the beach!" But the beach was a killing ground. German defenders dug into positions on the bluffs, had perfect overlapping fields of fire. Every square meter of sand was pre-registered for mortar and artillery. The tidal obstacles, steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes tipped with mines, became cover for men pinned down by fire so intense it seemed solid. This was Omaha Beach at 7 a.m. on June 6, 1944. The soft Americans were being slaughtered. Through German binoculars, officers watched with grim satisfaction. The intelligence had been correct. The Americans were faltering, taking catastrophic casualties, barely making progress beyond the waterline. Some craft had landed too far east or west, scattering units and breaking command structure. Bodies piled in the surf, equipment burned. The invasion was failing. But something else was happening too, something the Germans hadn't predicted. The Americans weren't retreating. Despite everything, despite the carnage, despite seeing friends torn apart, despite fear so intense it felt like drowning, they kept coming. When officers fell, sergeants took command. When sergeants fell, corporals stepped up. When corporals fell, privates organized themselves into fire teams and assault groups. Sergeant Lambert, wounded in the initial landing, patched himself up and started pulling wounded men out of the water. A colonel, pinned down behind a steel obstacle, shouted to anyone who could hear, "There are two kinds of people staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Engineers, under withering fire, blew gaps in the obstacles. Bangalore torpedoes cleared paths through wire. Rangers scaled cliffs at Point de Huck using ropes and ladders, under fire the entire way. Naval destroyers risked grounding themselves to provide point-blank fire support. By mid-morning, small groups had broken through. By afternoon, the Omaha Beach, the Nightmare Beach, was secure. German commanders monitoring the battle couldn't understand what they were seeing. These were supposed to be soft men, city boys, soldiers who'd break under pressure. Instead, they were displaying a stubborn, collective courage that defied every assumption. They improvised constantly, adapted to chaos, and refused to accept defeat. The other beaches, a different story. At Utah Beach, 70 miles west, the landing went almost perfectly. Strong currents pushed the assault craft 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone, which turned out to be a blessing. The actual target was heavily fortified. Where they landed was lightly defended. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, went ashore with the first wave despite a heart condition and arthritis. When he realized they'd landed in the wrong place, he made an instant decision. "We'll start the war from right here." Utah casualties were remarkably light, fewer than 200 on the first day. By nightfall, 23,000 troops were ashore and linking up with paratroopers who'd dropped behind the beaches. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian beaches, the story was similar to Omaha in intensity but different in outcome. British experience and specialized armor made the difference. Tanks fitted with flails cleared mines. Crocodile tanks shot jets of flame into German positions. Armored vehicle Royal Engineers laid bridges and demolished obstacles. The Canadians at Juno faced particularly heavy resistance. German defenders at Courcelette and Bernier fought with desperate determination. But Canadian infantry, supported by armor and naval fire, pushed inland faster than any other force. By day's end, they'd penetrated deeper into Normandy than anyone else, a remarkable achievement that would be overshadowed by the drama at Omaha. The 48-hour miracle. What happened next defied the predictions of every German military analyst. The Allies didn't consolidate. They didn't pause to regroup after the bloodbath of the first day. They pushed. Combat engineers worked through the night, bulldozing roads and clearing obstacles. Logistics units began unloading supplies on beaches that were still under occasional artillery fire. Medical stations treated thousands of wounded. Communications teams re-established contact with scattered units, and all the while, reinforcements kept coming. By June 7th, the beachheads had linked. By June 8th, more than 100,000 troops were ashore with tanks, artillery, and supplies. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted fortress, the defensive line that was supposed to throw any invasion back into the sea, had been breached in 48 hours. German counterattacks, when they finally came, were too little and too light. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's elite units, launched a ferocious assault near Cannes on June 7th. But Allied naval gunfire and air superiority shredded the attack. Panzer crews found themselves fighting not just infantry, but destroyers firing from miles offshore and fighter bombers that appeared within minutes of any German movement. Field Marshal Rommel, racing back from Germany, arrived to find his worst fears realized. "The enemy's command of the air restricts all movements," he wrote. "There's simply nothing we can do." In liberated French villages, civilians emerged from cellars to find not conquerors, but liberators. American soldiers shared chocolate with children, shook hands with old men, tried out broken French phrases. Eisenhower's promise, "We have come to liberate, not to conquer," wasn't propaganda. It was visible in every interaction. The soft Americans had landed, and they weren't leaving. Act 4. When Arrogance Breaks. The Reckoning. At Hitler's headquarters, the mood was apocalyptic. The Führer had been asleep when the invasion began. His staff, terrified of waking him, delayed informing him of the crisis for hours. By the time he received full reports, American and British forces were already pushing inland. His response was fury and disbelief. "Where are the panzers?" he screamed. "Why haven't they thrown them back into the sea?" His generals tried to explain. Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. The deception operation had succeeded. Significant forces remained at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Command structure had broken down. Communications were disrupted. Rommel had been away. None of it mattered to Hitler. In his mind, the failure was one of will, not capability. German soldiers should fight harder. Commanders should show more initiative. The Atlantic Wall should have held. "The soft Americans broke our wall," he said with venom. "How is this possible?" Field Marshal von Rundstedt, 70 years old and exhausted, gave the only honest answer: "Because we underestimated them." In the days following the invasion, as the true scope of the Allied achievement became clear, the psychological impact rippled through German command. Officers who'd spent years dismissing American military potential now faced a terrifying reality. They were fighting an enemy that combined overwhelming material advantage with competent, adaptable leadership and soldiers who simply wouldn't quit. The Atlantic Wall, the propaganda showpiece, the defensive line that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had lasted 2 days. Rommel's reflection. On June 10, Rommel wrote to his wife from France. "The enemy's superiority in the air and artillery is crushing. Our casualties are very high. I'm trying to do what I can, but the situation is very serious." In private correspondence captured after the war, his assessment was even bleaker. "They are not soft. They are clever and they are brave. Their organization is extraordinary. Every soldier seems to think for himself. When officers fall, others step forward. When plans fail, they adapt. We taught ourselves to believe they couldn't fight. Now we're paying the price for that arrogance. Rommel had seen the future on the beaches of Normandy, and it terrified him, not because the Americans were supermen, they weren't, but because they were systematic, resourceful, and backed by industrial and logistical capabilities that made German resistance increasingly futile. Within weeks, he would be involved in the failed July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler. Whether from despair or pragmatism or genuine moral awakening, the Desert Fox had come to believe that Germany had to end the war before it destroyed itself completely. The lesson unlearned. The tragedy, of course, was that the arrogance at the top remained largely unchanged. Hitler refused to acknowledge reality. He withdrew forces from Normandy to prepare for the real invasion at Calais that never came. He delayed committing the Panzer reserves until they could no longer influence the battle. He ordered fanatic defense of indefensible positions instead of strategic withdrawal. The Germans would continue fighting for 11 more months, inflicting and suffering horrific casualties. But Normandy was the beginning of the end. The soft Americans, along with their British, Canadian, and Allied partners, had kicked in the door. Now they would push until the whole rotten structure collapsed. Epilogue: The Echo of June 6th. On those beaches lay the bodies of the soft ones. Farm boys who'd never seen the ocean. Factory workers who'd built the ships that brought them here. Sons of immigrants fighting for a country that their parents chose. 20-year-olds who'd grown up during Depression and came of age in fire. They didn't conquer for glory. They conquered because they had to, because the alternative was a world where tyrants determined truth and jackboots crushed anyone who resisted. They conquered because, for all their faults and fears, they believed in something larger than themselves. Hitler's generals would never understand that. They'd built a world view on the premise that hardness meant strength, that cruelty made soldiers, that suffering bred warriors. They couldn't comprehend an army motivated by liberation rather than domination, by defense of principle rather than worship of power. They called the Americans soft because Americans valued life, weak because they believed in democracy, decadent because they came from a society that produced comfort and opportunity. And when the shooting started, when the test came, those soft Americans stormed through hell and took the beach anyway. The laughter died at Normandy. The arrogance broke on the stones of the Atlantic Wall. And history remembered not the mockery, but the courage, the ordinary courage of ordinary men who did the extraordinary when the world needed them most. They were soft until they weren't. And when the smoke cleared, an empire that thought itself invincible learned the hardest lesson of all. Underestimating your enemy doesn't make you strong. It just makes you blind. In memory of the approximately 4,400 Allied soldiers who died on D-Day, and the thousands more who were wounded in the liberation of Europe. Their sacrifice purchased the freedom we too often take for granted.